Erev Tov, tonight's question goes like this. Growing up, I was taught that one of the differences between Judaism and Catholicism is that unlike Catholics who believe in heaven and hell, Jews believe this is the life we live here and now on earth. There is no afterlife. We make the most of the life we're given. For years I believed that, yet I always felt my mother has been protecting me since she passed away when I was 17. However, the Kabbalists believe that the nefesh, ruach, the soul, lives on. How do we explain the discrepancy of beliefs? So tonight's class is a primer on Jewish views of the afterlife. So we need to begin with the Torah. Remember, Torah, if it's written by Moses, as tradition says, probably goes back to the 13th century BCE, and it encompasses from a Jewish point of view, Abraham, who's maybe 18th century BCE, all the way down to the end of Moses. So about 500 years or so. Here's the thing to understand, that in the Torah, there is no sense of an afterlife. The concept is that reward and punishment takes place here during your lifetime. And the most classic example of that is the second paragraph of the Shema, in which V'hayim Shema, in which we're taught that if you follow God's commandments, listen to God's words, then it will rain, the crops will grow, you will prosper. On the other hand, if you walk away from God's commandments, if you commit sins, then the sky will not give you rain, the earth will not give you food, you will quickly perish. So this earliest sense is that reward and punishment take place now, during your lifetime. The notion of immortality really is vested in the family. Often, you will see the phrase in the Bible when somebody dies. It says, he was gathered unto his fathers. And that's not meant in a metaphorical sense. That's meant in a literal sense. Here's what happened. In the ancient world, people were buried. Often the body was placed in a cave. This helps us understand the Jesus story. After the crucifixion, his body is placed in a cave. That wasn't going to be his permanent burial place. What happened is that after some time, the people went back into the cave, and all that was left of the body were bones. People gathered those bones, and they placed the bones together with the other bones from the family, from the clan. So you were literally being gathered unto your fathers, that your bones were now going to go with their bones. And that sense of family was really what immortality was about. It's not just me, it's my family who existed long before me and who will exist long after me. Now we can understand the importance of having children. Look, even to this very day, infertility is a great tragedy for families who desperately want to have children, but who are not able to. But we need to understand that in biblical times, this was even more so because your immortality existed through your genes, which were carried on in your children and their children. So we can understand maybe now how the sense of infertility that we find in the Torah, Sarah, and then Rebecca had difficulty conceiving, and of course Rachel had difficulty until she was able to have children, and then the Haftorah for Rosh Hashanah, Hannah, the mother of Samuel, she was unable to have children. So this is a recurring theme, and it was considered a greater tragedy than it even is to this day. So that's the notion. You lived on through your children. One more important thing to mention about the Bible is that there is a concept of Sheol. Sheol is the repository of all souls. It apparently was underground, beneath the surface of the earth. All we know about is that it was dark. Apparently it was dry, and it wasn't the equivalent of hell where the bad people go to be punished. This was where everybody's soul went. So the Bible had this idea: you live, your body dies, and your soul goes to this dark, dry place underground. What happens there, nobody knows, nobody speaks about it. It's a mystery. But that's as far as we know. All souls went to Sheol. So that's the Torah, that's the Bible. After a while, people, especially those who were being taught and who initially believed in this notion of V'haya im Shema, if you follow God's commandments, you will be rewarded. If you go astray, you will be punished. People began to see that's not how it works. There are good people who will suffer, and there are bad people who get away with murder. How do we square this with biblical theology? Well, that became the first problem that people had to deal with. And then we know historically that the Jewish people had contact with other cultures. They are exiled to Babylonia, then they're under Persian rule, later the Greeks, and ultimately the Greeks in terms of the Maccabee period. And then following the Greeks, we have the Romans. So the Israelites, later the Jews, have contact with many different cultures and peoples. And you know what? Over the course of time, we begin to acculturate. We begin to assimilate. We begin to adopt many of their ideas and their beliefs. Sometimes when it comes to idolatry, this adoption, this assimilation is a bad thing. But sometimes we adopt foreign ideas from different cultures, and they are worked into Judaism, and because they don't necessarily contradict Jewish ideas, then they hold, they're kept. So one of the things that these two problems, number one, contact with other cultures, and number two, a theological issue of, I don't get it. How is it possible that bad things happen to good people? This goes against the Torah. And so when you put one and one together, what you end up with is the notion of we can solve the theological problem if we believe in an afterlife. if we believe that justice will ultimately be done, not now, not during our lives, but in the next life, in the world to come. And so we find a change. The Torah has no conception of a real afterlife, but then sometime, let's say maybe 3rd century, 2nd century BCE, all of a sudden we do have a belief that there is something more than just this world. Now that's different from what the Torah and the Bible said. And you begin to see how Judaism evolves over the course of time. The first thing that we can really reference with a connection to an afterlife will come in the book of Daniel. You may remember we studied the book of Daniel a couple of years ago, and although Daniel pretends to be taking place sometime around the 6th century BCE, the mid-500s, we know, scholars tell us, that actually the book was written around the time of the Maccabees. So we're talking about the 2nd century BCE. And listen to this line, because it's the first, it comes at the end of the Bible, in the end of the Bible period, and it's the very first reference to an afterlife. So listen, many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth, meaning are dead, are buried in the ground. Many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to eternal life, others to reproaches, to everlasting abhorrence. So that seems to be a hint about either a reward or a punishment sometime after death. So we've now moved into a transition, and what began maybe 3rd century BCE, 2nd century BCE, we now begin to see new ideas. Either the old ideas didn't seem fleshed out and people want to know, tell me more, I want to know what exactly happens in that other life. Or there were different crises, problems that people faced, and new solutions were invented, or we came in contact with other ideas from other peoples, and we borrowed their concepts. So let's talk about a number of these ideas. The first one is what we would call Yemot HaMashiach. Okay, Yemot from Yom, meaning days. Yemot, the days of Mashiach. Mashiach is translated as Messiah. Actually, Messiah is just a transliteration. Messiah, Mashiach, it's the same word. All right? What does Mashiach really mean? It means the anointed one. Originally, the idea of the Mashiach, or the Messiah, was the king, because the king was anointed with olive oil. That's how he became the king, by being anointed. And so originally, the king was known as Melech HaMashiach, the anointed king. And of course, beginning with Saul, and then famously with David and Solomon, and then from about, if Saul is 1000 BCE, the kings go all the way down to approximately 580 BCE. So for some 400 plus years, we have kings. And some of them were good, some of them, most of them, were pretty rotten. And what happens is the king became a symbol of the Jewish people. King became the symbol of power, and especially if there were threats from enemies, it was the king who led the army of the Jews to protect us. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. So originally, when we speak about the Mashiach, the Messiah, what we meant was simply the king, and then the next king, and then the next king. In 586, the Jewish kingdom of Judah comes to an end, and the Jews are now without a symbol of their nation, of their leadership. We are leaderless, which meant we were powerless. Our enemies destroyed us. We had no army. We had no king to direct us, to lead us. So people began to pray and to wish for a time when there would be a king once again, when we can get rid of our enemies and a new king will be anointed. And now he will form an army and protect us and defeat our enemies and bring us peace and security. So let's say from 550 BCE for the next 200, 300, 400 years, this becomes the dream. We can't wait until we have once again our anointed king. And of course, that anointed king in Judea needed to be somebody descended from the line of King David, because in Judea, kingship was hereditary. Okay, so what happens after a while, it becomes clear that we're not going to get a king, a normal king. And people began to say, you know, if only God would intervene. And instead of being a normal king who will lead us against the Roman Empire, doesn't seem, reasonable that the small, weak Jewish people are going to overcome. We needed some kind of supernatural help. So now the Mashiach, the anointed one, was no longer a king, mere king. It was somebody sent by God to defeat our enemies and to bring about peace and tranquility and security for the Jewish people. So we've moved from the natural idea of an anointed king to a supernatural idea of the Messiah. Now, in the 1st century CE, around the year 30 or so, the Roman oppression of the Jewish people was overwhelming. The Jews at that time said now would be a good time for God to send the anointed one who would lead us against our enemies. And many people focused on a wonder worker, miracle worker, healer, whose name was Yeshua, son of Joseph and Miriam. Later, he becomes known as Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary. And many Jews, because he was charismatic, because he was a healer, he seemed to do great wonders, many Jews said, this guy must be the anointed one. And that's why in the Gospels, they go to great pains to show that Jesus was from the line of David, which he needed to be if he's going to become the Messiah, the Mashiach, the anointed king who sent by God to restore the Jewish people. When the Romans, hear of this, wait a minute, you all are saying that you think this guy is the one who will become your king, who will defeat us, go to war against us. So naturally, the Romans weren't going to wait around. They immediately executed this person. And you'll remember from the Jesus movies, right? Above on the cross, above the head of the crucified man, were the letters INRI, right? Which stand for Jesus of Nazareth, Rex Judaeum, King of the Jews. And that was his crime, that the Romans were saying, you people think he is the anointed king who's going to lead you against us? We're going to take care of that very quickly. Okay, so it became clear to most of the Jews at that time that Yeshua ben Yosef and Miriam, he wasn't the guy. But those Jews continued, and our people continued to look forward to God sending this anointed one who would be the Messiah, the Mashiach, who would save us from wherever we happened to be, whatever difficulties we were facing. This became such an important part of Jewish tradition that in Maimonides' 13 Articles of Faith, Anima amin bi'amuna shalema, I believe with a perfect faith, beviat HaMashiach, in the coming of the Messiah, v'afal pi sheyitma mea, and even though he may tarry, afal pi achakelo, I will nevertheless wait for him. So this became, part of a very powerful Jewish belief, waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And the Messianic era was just like he was going to be a supernatural figure. The time when he came, Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah, would be not an ordinary time, right? It would be at the end of history, and there would no longer be death, and there would be all sorts of other incredible things happening, which we'll talk about now. So the first thing in looking towards the ideal future, we speak about the Messiah and the days of the Messiah, the Messianic era. There are many modern Jews today who are uncomfortable with talking about believing in the idea of a supernatural human sent by God who will become this incredible leader. So instead of looking forward to the Messiah, we look forward to the Messianic era, a time when the end of days, when all people will be able to live in peace together. So that's the first thing. Next, we now move on to something that we call, and that developed, that we call Olam Haba, the world to come. And here we have a notion that this is Olam Hazeh, this world. You die, you're buried, but there will be Olam Haba. There will be a world to come. Maybe we call it heaven. We'll see that there are some other permutations going on here. But the idea is the body dies and the soul goes to heaven. Right? Now, what happens to that soul in heaven, we'll get to in a minute. So many people, Jews, continue to say, you know what, if this world is filled with suffering and poverty and sickness and unhappiness and early premature death, then it all will be worked out in Olam Haba, in the world to come, when the righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will either, will basically be punished in one way or another, which we'll talk about. So here we now have this idea of Olam Haba. Now, Another development over the course of time, and I got to tell you that you've got all these different ideas and they don't necessarily fit together like a puzzle perfectly. Sometimes these ideas contradict one another. In this time and place, people came up with an idea. In this time and place, people came up with a different idea. And some people like this, some people like that. Sometimes there's an attempt to reconcile them. Sometimes there isn't. But that's the point, that Judaism is continuing to grow, to evolve, to change, and there are all these different ideas. The next idea, after Yemot HaMashiach, the Messianic era, and Olam Haba, the world to come, is Techiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection, revivification, right, of the dead. And here we have this strong idea that the body dies, is buried, but at the end of history, perhaps when the Messiah comes, maybe not, sometime in the future, there will be, when people, the dead, will rise from their graves and will live here in bodies for eternity. That's different than, Olam Haba, in which the body remains dead and disintegrated, but the soul lives on in heaven. Here you have an idea that the soul is reunited with the body and now lives here permanently. This became a critical issue and argument and debate in the first century among Jews. The Pharisees, one group of Jews, believed very strongly in resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees, another group, did not believe in such an issue. It may be interesting that the Pharisees represented more the lower class, the poor. Sadducees may represent the elites, maybe the rich. If the rich are doing well, they don't need to look forward to something else. If the common people, the poor people, are living miserable lives, this is something that they're going to believe in very strongly. Among the Jews, you had this debate. Yes, we believe in resurrection. No, we don't believe in resurrection. And ultimately, it became very powerful, this debate, very strong and probably very bitter. The Amidah, when it was put together, maybe 30 years after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in the year 70, around the year 90, 100, Jews began to put together prayers. And the Amidah became the central prayer. And the second paragraph of the Amidah speaks about our belief in the resurrection of the dead. Think about the blessing that we say, Baruch Ata Adonai Mechayeh HaMeitim. Mechayeh, from Chai, God is the one who gives life, causes life to the Meitim, to the dead. Imagine this political situation, a debate between Pharisees and Sadducees, who's going to win? Well, if you want to pray with us in our synagogue, you're going to have to use a prayer which basically says, we believe in the resurrection of the dead. You can imagine that Sadducees, some of them would probably say, I don't believe it, I'm not praying with you. Whereas, the Jews, this was a kind of a catechism of what the Jews of the first, second century believed, right? And the idea is that we put it into the Amidah, so 3 times a day we express our faith that God is so powerful, he will cause all the dead to live once again. Especially after the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70, maybe the slaughter of as many as 1 million people. The idea was, how could God allow this? And one answer was, well, he will make up for it by bringing all the dead back to life. Okay? I gotta tell you that I'm not sure that very many conservative or Reform Jews believe in resurrection of the dead in its literal meaning and its literal understanding, whereas Orthodoxy, they very much do. That, again, is one of the 13 articles of faith of Maimonides, Ani Ma'amin, that, at the end of time, the dead will be resurrected and will live again. I got to tell you that this brings up all sorts of interesting questions. Suppose, for instance, you live to be a feeble, old, decrepit 90-year-old back in those days, and now you die and you're resurrected. Are you going to be resurrected as a feeble, old, decrepit 90-year-old for eternity? Or suppose a baby dies. In the ancient world, infant mortality was very common. Babies are going to be resurrected as babies? Or what happened if a man married a woman and she died in childbirth, and then he remarries another woman? In the time of the resurrection of the dead, is he going to have 2 wives? What's that all about? If somebody lost a limb, which was probably a lot more frequent than it is today, given disease or given warfare, when you're resurrected, are you going to be resurrected without that limb or with it? And how's that going to happen? So there's a beautiful idea that meets a very human need about you died too soon under terrible circumstances. We want to have a second chance. So resurrection is that chance. But when you actually try to think through the logistics of it and what exactly happens, there are so many issues and problems that people said, I don't want to think about it, I just believe in it, and let God worry about it. It's not up to me, it's not my problem. So there we have Techiyat HaMeitim. Then we have, among a small circle of Jews, mainly Jews who follow Kabbalah or mysticism, we have the notion of reincarnation. Believe it or not, there are some Jews who do believe in reincarnation. The body dies, the soul is placed in another body. In Hebrew, we call this Gilgul Nishamot, the cycling or recycling of souls. And one of the interesting things is people, explain, how do we have a convert? Why would somebody choose to convert to Judaism? And Jews who believe in reincarnation say that in a previous life, this non-Jew had been a Jew. He had been a soul, a Jewish soul. He dies, he's put into another body, he's Christian or some other religion. And now the soul, that Jewish soul in a Christian body, ultimately wants to make things right, and so he converts to Judaism. And of course, in Jewish folklore, we have the very famous idea of a Dybbuk. Dybbuk, literally the Yiddish word, but the Hebrew Dybbuk or devek means to stick. In modern Hebrew, devek is glue. And the idea of a dybbuk was a soul who sticks to another body. One of the most famous Yiddish plays is called the Dybbuk, and it's almost you need to have an exorcism. And so we would think of, reincarnation, that's an Indian concept, not Jewish. Exorcism, that's what Catholics do. But among some Jews, there is this belief in reincarnation, and there is this belief that sometimes you need to have an exorcism in order to drive out this soul that has taken over somebody else's body while their soul was still in it. So now we have a thought about the idea of what exactly is heaven or hell. So we have the notion of Gan Eden. People in Yiddish often use the term Gan Eden, literally Garden of Eden. And that becomes a Jewish way of referencing paradise, heaven. Okay? Even though it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, later Judaism says Gan Eden, that's heaven in the future where we will all go. Now, there's another issue in question as to what takes place when you get there. If you go to Gan Eden, the next world, what exactly happens in that next world? There's a wonderful Jewish folk song, a Yiddish folk song, called Asudenu, from Seudah, which means a meal, but it's about a banquet, the banquet. So listen to this. Hear the words of Asudenu. Tell us, dear Rabbi, what will happen when the Messiah comes? When the Messiah comes, we will have a feast. What will we eat at the feast? We will eat the wild ox and the Leviathan. Wild ox was considered this humongous giant creature, and the Leviathan was considered like the whale. And so we're being told in the world to come that when you go there, you're going to be sitting at a banquet. Okay, what do they serve at the banquet? Meat and fish. Okay? Then, what will we drink, Rabbi, at the feast? The wine preserved from the time of creation. Who will explicate the Torah to us at the feast? In other words, are we just going to sit there? Jews always have to learn something when they sit down to eat. So we're being told, Moses, our teacher, will explicate the Torah to us. So there in heaven, at this incredible banquet, Moses will stand up and will teach us Torah. Who will play for us at the feast? At a banquet, you need to have music. And the answer is King David will play for us at the feast. Who will say words of wisdom for us at the feast? King Solomon will say words of wisdom. Probably give us a proverb, something like that. Who will dance for us at the feast? Miriam the prophetess will dance for us. King Solomon will say words of wisdom. King David will play for us. Moses, our teacher, will explicate the Torah. We will drink the preserved wine. We will eat the wild ox and the Leviathan at the feast. So here you see a folk image of this really very material idea of what's going to take place in heaven. On the other hand, you find in the Talmud, in Brachot, Rav, a 3rd century Babylonian teacher, who said, "There is neither eating nor drinking nor any begetting of children," in other words, no sex, "nor bargaining or jealousy or hatred or strife. All that the righteous do is sit with their crowns on their head and enjoy the light of the divine presence." So the idea is that in the world to come, it's an incredibly spiritual thing. We're sort of in the light, God's divine light. And that's sufficient, and that's all we need and all we care about. And that was considered heaven, the greatest thing that there possibly could be. So that seems to be two different ideas of what Gan Eden is all about. In opposition to Gan Eden, we have something called Gehinnom. In English, it's often written as Gehenna, but in Hebrew and in Yiddish, it's Gehinnom. Ge in Hebrew means a valley. Hinnom, was the name of a particular guy who lived thousands of years ago. And the valley of Hinnom's valley, was just outside the walls of Jerusalem. You could still go to what's called Gehinnom today, right outside the walls of the old city. And the name Gehinnom becomes associated with hell because at a certain point in time, some Jews began worshiping the god Moloch in the valley of Hinnom, just outside the walls of Jerusalem. And from what we understand, it was a statue, and the stomach of the life-size statue, the stomach of the statue was a hollowed out area in which you put wood and you built a fire, and the arms of Moloch were like this, so that it was almost like a sliding board. And what people often did was they brought their babies and placed it into the hands of the statue, and the baby would roll down the arms right into the fire and be burned. This was considered the worst possible thing ever. So therefore, what took place in the valley of Hinnom, or Gehinnom, becomes associated with hell. And with hell, we have the Jewish idea versus the Christian idea. You know, the Christian idea, of course, is if you're righteous, you become an angel, you get your wings, your halo, you fly around the clouds, and you play harp. If you are wicked, you go to hell, you're burning, the devils are poking you with pitchforks. We all know the imagery. In the Jewish idea, Gehinnom, there's a couple of thoughts. One thought is it was a purgatory, that all souls, righteous or not righteous, all souls had to suffer punishment for whatever deeds they did. And this would take a maximum of 12 months. The most wicked person was tortured, punished for 12 months in Gehinnom, in hell. We don't know exactly, probably dealt with some kind of fire and burning and other horrible things, but at most it was for 12 months. If you were a pretty good guy, you'd spend a minimum amount of time there. The worst person would spend 12 months there. Now, what happened after 12 months? or after you had done your penance in this purgatory called Gehinnom. If you were righteous and the bad stuff had been burned out, you now go to Gan Eden, to heaven. If, on the other hand, you were wicked, then that was it. You were dead. You were ended. And you got none of the reward and only the punishment. By the way, something very interesting. The notion of 12 months of punishment as a maximum. One of the things that we know from a story about Rabbi Akiba is that originally the reason you said the mourner's Kaddish, and you said it for a year, you said mourner's Kaddish, you were trying to help out your parents during this period of purgatory when they are suffering. And by your going to synagogue and saying this prayer and having the congregation repeat Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach Li'olam Lo Maya and getting a minyan of people to praise God, that in a sense made things easier and lighter for your dead relative in purgatory. Now, since we said the worst person would suffer for 12 months, if you said Kaddish for 12 months, you were basically admitting that your relative was a rotten person. Therefore, the Jewish folk custom became that we say Kaddish for parents only for 11 months, right? And, a very interesting connection with that folk tale about purgatory. So, what happens after these 12 months or whatever time? Again, for the dead, it's all over and there's nothing else, oblivion. For the righteous, it's now eternity in Gan Eden, whether that meant the physical thing of the Sudanyu, of the feast, or whether it meant the spiritual aspect, shining in God's presence and the light of God's presence. And one last point is the fascinating idea that both Jews believe that both Jews and non-Jews could go to heaven. I wrote an email about this a couple of weeks ago. We believe that righteous Gentiles, those who observe the 7 basic laws of humanity, they have a place in the world to come. It's a lot harder for a Jew to get into heaven than it is for a non-Jew, right? So there's more of a burden on being a Jew. This is the Jewish idea of this. One final thing that I wanted to address, the question was, I've always felt my mother has been protecting me since she passed away. So I need to tell you that there is a Jewish concept of a melitz yosher. Literally, it is a pleader of righteousness. It is an advocate on high. And in Jewish folklore, there is the idea that just as we have to look after the dead by saying Kaddish and perhaps saving them from some of the terrible punishments, so too the dead can have an impact on us. When we're in trouble, the dead can go to God. They're closer to Him after all, and they can plead for us. So the melitz yosher is the dead person trying to intercede on our behalf. In fact, in an Orthodox burial service, one of the last things we say as we're burying somebody is we ask them to be a melitz yosher for us. You're now leaving this world, you're going to the next world. When you're in that world, don't forget us, remember us. When we're in trouble, do your part to try to help us and intercede on our behalf. Okay? So, what have we learned from this? We see that there are many Jewish ideas about an afterlife, from there is no afterlife to yes, there's the Messianic era, there's the world to come, there's the resurrection of the dead, there's reincarnation, there's the feast, there's basking in the light of God, there is the purgatory of hell. And again, these ideas don't necessarily flow logically one from the other. They were developed at different times in different places. Sometimes they fit together, sometimes they contradict one another. Sometimes Jews attempt to reconcile them, to figure out, well, this takes place here, and then that takes place. The Messiah comes, then there's the resurrection, then you live forever. But it's not necessarily logical, because these develop over the course of time. We do need to say the following. While there is an idea, there are many ideas about resurrection, and there are ideas about a world to come, nevertheless, we find that, yes, indeed, Jews believe that this is the world that counts, that what matters most is here, not then. We don't look forward the same way that Catholics do to a better world and the world to come. I often have thought that, for a Catholic who suffers a terrible tragedy, the notion of, well, they're in a better place and they're now with their beloved family members who have died, must be a source of great comfort to them. But on the other hand, the Jewish view, which is basically, we don't know what happens, and we're not pinning anything on that next life. It may be a more difficult way. It may be harder for us to get comfort if we think this is all there is. But it may be a more realistic idea than the notion of creating a world to come and an afterlife. So you're free to believe, not believe. What you are expected to do is to behave like a mensch while you're here.